This is a Bloody Vegans production.
Well, I grew up, like most people, eating animals and not really thinking anything of it. And in 1992, I was very privileged to take some time off and travel around the world for a couple of years. And I was living in Germany with a friend, and I suggested that we go down to Pamplona in Spain and run with the bulls. You know, this annual event takes place in July. And so we took the train down. It was this big adventure, and we did the bull run. And I was probably the only person of the thousands of people there to feel ashamed afterward. It was just this, I can't really describe it, Jim, and convey the feeling, but it was just this deep sense that something was wrong. Here I was not really thinking about other species growing up, but suddenly there was this seed planted in me that there was something wrong in what we were doing. And I wish I could say that I went vegan that day or even vegetarian, but that didn't happen. But as I said, a seed was planted. And a few months later, I was privileged to live in India for a few months. And I was living in Ladakh in the Himalayas with a Buddhist family for a couple of months. And almost everything I ate came from their garden. And so I was essentially vegan. The only exception was they would have buttered tea, which was kind of like a soup. So they did have some cows about, but the cows were there for the milk. And they didn't have electricity. They didn't have a refrigerator. And as it got close to winter, they dug a big hole in the garden, and they harvested the fruits and vegetables, and they buried them in this garden. And they let a cow come into the yard and nibble on the stalks and stems that remained. And I was about, 6 or 7 feet away from this beautiful brown cow and just watching her eat and enjoying herself. And I just realized that she had as much right, as much desire to live as I did. And so I, at that point, stopped eating cows. And eventually I came back to the United States and stopped eating chickens and fishes and other animals. And it took me another 10 years, but I went vegan finally in September of 2001. So I just celebrated my 20th anniversary. And that was really a shorter process. I read Diet for a New America by John Robbins, and that inspired me to investigate the dairy and egg industries. And I went to a sanctuary for farmed animals, and I met some of these chickens and some of these cows who had been rescued from these industries. And I just decided on that day I didn't want to support that anymore. So I went vegan. And at that point, I wanted to do more to help animals. So I started becoming an activist.
Incredible. From your experience and, traveling around the world, coming back to the States, do you think this kind of purposeful, intentional kind of distance created is ultimately the sort of problem, if you like, that if more people saw what you'd seen, they would draw the same conclusions?
I think we all get to this point in a different way. We're all on a different path. Certainly mine is unique to me, and it took longer than I was hoping it would. But I do think that we distance ourselves. I do think we have this cognitive dissonance where we decide that, we can hold these two opposing ideas at the same time and feel okay about exploiting animals, yet understanding, on the other hand, that these animals feel pain and they suffer. And I think it's becoming more difficult for people who consume animals to do so and deny the knowledge that's out there. I think it's becoming more evident. We have more documentaries, we have more books, we have television shows, because the media, the reach of media has become much more prevalent than it was even 10 years ago. And so I think it's becoming more difficult for consumers to deny the fact that they do have some knowledge. They do understand. Yeah, animals do feel pain. And I think they feel a level of guilt. And that's one reason when you're at a protest or you're doing some form of activism, or even just talking to somebody who eats meat, they often push back and make jokes and try to justify it in some way. And I think that's because they understand that what they're doing is, and I'm reluctant to use the word wrong, but for lack of a better word, they understand that it's wrong to eat animals. And I think they feel guilty about it.
Yeah. When you moved into the world, the vegan community and so on, and you mentioned you sort of became an activist, what did that initially look like? What sort of steps did you take?
Well, that was very difficult for me because I didn't want to join one of the major groups. I've never really been a joiner. I've really been somebody who likes to kind of go out on his own and figure things out. And I didn't want to volunteer for a big organization. So at the time, there weren't many resources out there to become an activist. You either joined a big group or you asked a lot of questions, which is what I did. So I would ask everybody I knew about activism, and I would email some of the groups, and some people there were kind enough to respond with advice. And it was a very slow process. But one of the things I did was started volunteering at a sanctuary for farmed animals, and that introduced me to more activists. So that was a big help. And I also started volunteering for a sanctuary for rabbits, a shelter here in the Bay Area called Save a Bunny. And I learned a lot about rabbits, and I love the fact that they're vegan. So that was it was an easy fit for me. And then started fostering rabbits. And from there, I just got more and more involved and started doing more writing and writing for magazines like Satya and Veg News. And that introduced me to even more activists. So it sort of built from there. And then I started working on books. So it was a progression for me, slow, but it was very rewarding.
Let's talk about that a second. Your journey into writing. Was that sort of almost a reaction to your veganism? It felt like an outlet for you, or did it come much before and you kind of then adapted the subject matter as you became vegan?
Yeah, the latter. I had always been a writer. I had been writing for magazines for many years. And I was actually, when I got back from India, I started writing for a magazine called Hinduism Today. And they asked me to write an article that would be their cover story about the history of vegetarianism. And that was actually what inspired me to read John Robbins, because I was doing research for this article. And the more I read, the more I realized that I need to be vegan. And the more I realized that I needed to be vegan, the more I realized I needed to be writing about that. So I was always writing about social justice issues. I had been doing some volunteer work for a Tibetan justice society group in the Bay Area, helping Tibetan refugees. And I had met Tibetan refugees when I was living in northern India, so that was a good fit for me too. It was a topic I felt passionate about. But as I decided that I wanted to do more writing for animals, I became vegan, and I started doing writing for Satya magazine, which is unfortunately no longer around, but it was a great publication for activists and for people who were kind of breaking into writing in that world, because they were very forgiving about what I wrote. They were happy to read anything that I proposed. They were great editors, so I learned a lot. And then from there, I had some experience, and I was able to start writing for Veg News. And after having some articles under my belt, a publisher contacted me and asked me if I would be interested in writing a book for them about animal rights. And this was John Hunt Publishing in England, and they have an imprint called Changemakers, and they had not done an animal rights book at all. And I at the time I said no. I don't really know what I could contribute to the literature that was already out there. But they said, well, think about it and, get back to us if you have any ideas. And then I remembered how difficult it was for me in the beginning to get started as an activist. And so I thought, well, why not write a book that consolidates a lot of these ideas, a lot of these best practices that I learned from other activists. So I kind of went back and interviewed about 120 or so activists around the world and got their recommendations. So it's really their voice in the book more than mine. I have a few of my own ideas, a few of the things that I learned, but mostly it's these other activists, these really remarkable people I admired, and that became Striking at the Roots, which is the first book. This is actually it's actually in a 10th anniversary edition now, and it was just a very good learning tool for me, and it's been great to hear from activists around the world telling me how they're using it and how important it's been for them, and that's been very rewarding for me.
I can imagine that interviewing 120 activists in the process of writing this book, your view of the world of activism, animal rights, etc., probably changed quite fundamentally. Would that be fair to say? Because of
what they were telling me?
Yeah, just because of it, the sheer scale of the number of people that you're suddenly opening yourself up to. Did it introduce any kind of new ideas or different perspectives that perhaps in your own personal journey prior to that you hadn't necessarily come across?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me that came out of that in terms of a learning experience was that there's really nothing that we should ignore. There's no tactic that we should ignore. There's no strategy that we should be putting down. That, we should be open to all ways of getting our message out there. And I think probably at the time I was a lot less radical. I was probably one of these people who thought, don't get arrested, don't make waves, don't, just be nice. And as I was interviewing activists and hearing their stories, I realized that they were very effective in doing some things that would be considered illegal. And so I tried them out. I did open rescue. I literally broke into factory farms and rescued animals, something that I never would have considered before. I admired people who did that, but I didn't think that was for me. So it really was a learning experience for me. It really taught me that we have a lot of tools in the toolbox, so to speak, and we shouldn't ignore any of them.
I'd love to get your perspective on, over the 20 years of being vegan, 10 years since publishing your first book solely, centered around activism and, direct action, different methods, and thinking about the way where the vegan community is now. Obviously, there's over 6 billion smartphones in the world, that there's all kinds of social media in people's hands, in people's pockets, much better ways to spread messages in many ways. Arguably, on the flip side, perhaps a bit more sanitization of vegan messages, you could argue, depending on which way where you're kind of frequenting online. What's your view of kind of the vegan community now, activism as it stands, and that kind of many and varied approach to activism tactics, if you like?
Well, Jim, I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. On the one hand, it's been encouraging to see young people getting more involved and to see their passion and to see how it's sort of pushing that peanut forward, how we're slowly making progress in some areas. And it's also been very exciting to see the impact of documentaries, which if there hadn't been social media, I don't know that we would have had the success. Blackfish came out in 2013, and it just made such a huge difference for marine mammals in captivity, such that it's now illegal in many countries to keep these animals in captivity, to breed them in captivity, even here in the United States. So that's been very, very rewarding. But at the same time, it's been frustrating because there's so many things that we were so close to having achieved a victory, like the fur industry a few years ago. We were so close, and somehow the fur industry picked up momentum again. That's changed. I'm very happy in the last few months, that's really changed. And I really think we're seeing the death knell for the fur industry. And then the other one has been animal testing. This is one of the most difficult things for us to achieve a victory in, and yet other countries are banning animal testing, but in the United States we haven't banned it, and so that's been very sad to see. And when I say animal testing, I'm talking about several levels. I'm not just talking about cosmetics testing. I'm talking about animals used in labs for medical research. I'm talking about animals being used in medical school for doctors and veterinarians. I'm talking about animals being used in grammar school for dissection. Like probably frogs being dissected is the one that most people are familiar with. I'm talking about animals being used in the military in experiments. So there's all these levels, and it's so heartbreaking to read and to see these examples of how these animals are used, and know that that we're so far away in many respects from getting these things banned. So I think it's a mixed bag, Jim. It's again, I don't know that my answer is very clear, but I think there's definitely been some positive things. There's been some reasons to celebrate, and then there's these other things that are quite frustrating because you think that we'd be actively pursuing, for example, animal testing, and there's not a lot of groups who are doing it.
What do you think needs to shift in that space? Do you think there is when we talk about animal testing specifically, that do you think there's a sense in the mainstream? It's almost there's too much of a sense in the mainstream kind of non-vegan world, if you like, that it is this necessary evil. I think about like COVID vaccines and so on, and perhaps almost that idea that animal testing is absolutely necessary becoming even more entrenched in people's minds. Your perspective on that would be quite interesting, I think.
Well, my sense, and I don't know that this is correct, but my sense is that it's going to take substantial advances in technology. We have to reach the point where we have adequate substitutes that don't use animals, whether it's synthetic skin or lab on a chip or synthetic organs, things that medical researchers especially can use in place of animals. And that's been, we've seen some advances in that. So there is some hope there. But I think that's going to be the key as opposed to activism. I think that as much as I'd love to say, if we can get activists rallied behind this issue, we can win it. I think it's really going to come down to having adequate humane options that researchers can use and feel confident in, that they can say, this is going to give us the answers that we need, and we don't have to use animals.
Yeah, absolutely. As kind of activists today, thinking 2021, and thinking about COP26 is on in the UK right now in Glasgow. Obviously, climate change being front and centre of many of our news cycles right now. We can talk about MBR and the kind of the beagle testing that's going on in the UK too. There's these different kind of fronts where animal activism has got a place, a story to tell, etc. Do you think there is a particular avenue that you've seen to be more effective insofar as persuading the mainstream, wider society, if you like, whether it be climate change, animal testing, is there a particular one, or do you think actually the tactics need to be many and varied and we need to target every aspect?
I think they need to be many and varied, but from my experience, and again, I don't know that this is going to be true for everybody, or that everybody will agree, but from my experience, the tactic that seems to hit home is telling stories, sharing with people, actual animals. The image of the beagles being rescued in Italy, it was 4 or 5 years ago, but they were literally being lifted over a barbed wire fence from an animal lab in Italy. I mean, you could see these animals' faces. They were not just a statistic. They weren't just a number anymore. It was, and I think that image and that story really helped people understand what was going on. And I think that helped push the peanut a little bit further again. But I really believe in the importance of telling stories and letting people understand what these animals experience. And if you can, use a specific example. And if you have video that's not terribly graphic, or an image you can show that's not terribly graphic. I'm not a proponent for really graphic images, although they do have their place and some people can tolerate them. I just don't. I don't like them personally, so I don't use them. And I tell activists, don't feel you have to watch these horrible documentaries because I worry about burnout, etc. But anyway, back to the question. I really think telling stories and helping people understand that we're really talking about individual animals here is a very effective tool.
Do you think that, you mentioned a couple of things there that sort of struck a bit of a chord with me and made me think about, when you talk about storytelling, made me think about other movements, thinking about intersectionality within the vegan community. Do you think that one of the things that I've seen, I'll rephrase, one of the things that I've seen within sort of social media, quote unquote, vegan community, is that there's a push and a pull between the kind of single issue vegan who thinks that they shouldn't be involved in any other activism about any other subject, and then those, and I probably sit more on this side of the fence, who think actually kind of all oppressions are interlinked and we are stronger together. Do you think that that there is a tipping of the scale one way or the other in terms of the vegan community, or in over the 20 years that you've seen things, or is it just as much division as there was at the beginning, and that's just the nature of any group?
I think we're seeing more vegans and more activists becoming aligned with what they're calling intersectionality. Intersectionality is a very specific term created by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw to address an intersection of racism and sexism. So I'm reluctant to use that term and apply it to animal activism, but I know it's used quite a bit, and I think I understand what activists are saying when they use it. They're really talking about not being siloed, as you put it. Yeah. I have to excuse me. So I think that we're seeing more activists agreeing with that. We're trying to not be so siloed, and we're trying to understand that oppression is oppression. So whether it's sexism or racism or speciesism or ableism or classism or anything else, they all have their roots in oppression. They're all these marginalized communities, and we're not going to have liberation for animals until we have liberation for everybody. That's a very difficult concept for activists to get, because they tend to get especially new activists, they tend to get very passionate about just animals. They tend to focus on just animals and not understand that, there's a whole history here. There's a whole reason, patriarchy and everything else. There's a whole reason why we're exploiting animals and why it's acceptable. And I say that not including us or your listeners, but, that's why that the world at large considers it acceptable. So there's a big issue here. It's very complicated, and I'm not an expert in it by any means. And I even wrote a book, one of my other books, A Vegan Ethic, is really about taking a holistic approach to veganism and to animal rights and understanding that all these oppressions are connected. So in answer to your question, I think we are seeing a movement toward that, toward accepting it. And that's very, it gives me a lot of hope. That's very encouraging. But, there's still a lot of people out there who who just want to work on one thing. You know, they just want to work on one issue. And that's okay for them. If that keeps you in the movement, if that keeps you from getting burned out, it's okay, provided you understand that there are more issues out there, that there are larger issues to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, like you say, it's complex and nuanced, and I think that's where my concern lies sometimes, is some of the social media platforms, are they capable of delivering nuance, subtlety, and argument? And I sometimes think there's tons of benefits, but one of the potential pitfalls is, you know, we don't have these nuanced dialogues quite as much maybe as we would have done if, admittedly, they would have been smaller, but they would have been face to face and with groups and over the course of time, you know?
Yeah, nothing beats face-to-face activism as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you know, I mentioned Blackfish. It had a huge impact, obviously reached millions of people. And so I don't discount that. But one-on-one activism is really so effective and hard to beat. And that's where you get the context, right? That's where you get the nuance.
Yeah, 100%. Let's turn to the latest book, shall we? The way of the rabbit.
Sure.
Let's talk of the, you know, what inspired it. Let's talk about the journey of that book. There it is.
The Way of the Rabbit. As I mentioned, I was volunteering for a group out here called Save a Bunny, and I was failing at every single attempt to foster, meaning that I would adopt every rabbit. I just kept falling in love with them. They're just these wonderful little vegan beings. And I just always had an affinity for rabbits as a species, even as a child. And as I was writing these other books, you know, people would say, you should really write a book about rabbits. And I thought, well, I don't want to write a book about rabbits because there's all these horrible stories to tell. You know, they're exploited. I often say they're probably the most exploited animal in terms of all the types of exploitation they're subjected to of any other species. You know, they're used for everything. And for years I would just think, well, I'm not going to write a book about rabbits. And then one day I thought, well, why not just write a book that celebrates them? It doesn't have to be that big. You know, it's only 225 pages or so, but just focus on their role in literature and history and popular culture and as household companions, and just have a fun book, have a cozy read for people. And so writing this book was a catharsis for me. For 2 years, I just spoke to biologists and paleontologists and historians and scholars from all over the world, asking them about what makes rabbits special and from their point of view. And it also includes my own interpretations, my own experience with rabbits. And it's just a fun book. And so for 2 years, I had the best time and didn't have to worry about, oh, today I'm going to write this ghastly passage that people are going to cringe when they read. It's all just fun. So it was a great pleasure.
I think it actually plays, as you mentioned, there plays a really important role for, you know, us in the vegan community, people involved, you know, directly in activism. You talk about burnout earlier, you know, that actually just celebrating, you know, who we're trying to save, who we're talking about, who's at the center of our activism sometimes is a welcome pressure release. So
yeah,
I'm kind of grateful to you for that.
Oh, thank you. And I'm really amazed by how many people who work in rabbit rescue are vegan. I mean, you'd think it'd be natural if you rescue animals that you'd be vegan. And I didn't think that would be the case so much, but I'm hearing from people who run sanctuaries in England and in Canada and Australia and the United States, and they enjoy the book and they happen to be vegan as well. And I think that's just wonderful.
Absolutely. Well, in the process of research, obviously you were kind of very well versed in the world of rabbits before, but you know, when you researched the book, was there anything, you know, really surprising that kind of jumped out, you know, perhaps when you were looking at the history of rabbit?
The thing that jumps out at me, excuse me, about the history of rabbits that I found so surprising is that, you know, we have wild rabbits and we have domesticated rabbits, and they both have their own populations in the world, but every single domesticated rabbit today comes from the European rabbit. The Ornithologus caniculus is the Latin name, from the Iberian Peninsula in Europe. They all, every single rabbit who is in a home today, or unfortunately in a lab today, or in a sanctuary, they came from this one species, this one particular species. I find that amazing. And the other things that I learned that I found surprising were more biological. For example, rabbits don't really hop. Even though classically you think of rabbits as being hopping animals, they actually have what biologists call a half-bound gait, where their back limbs, their back legs work in tandem and their front paws land separately. So and their teeth continue to grow, which is one reason that they need to be constantly eating hay as domesticated rabbits or grass in the wild. They're constantly growing. And that their ears can turn, they can rotate 270 degrees, and they can monitor two sounds at the same time. And that they're eavesdropping on conversations between birds or between squirrels to know if it's safe for them to come out. I mean, they're just absolutely fascinating animals. One of the reasons that I call it an affectionate history of nature's most surprising species is because of all these things I learned that even as a rabbit lover for many years, I had no idea.
I'd love to explore a bit further that piece about that all domesticated. You say all domesticated rabbits come from the same community. Without giving away too much about the book, obviously we encourage people to pick up a copy. But how did that come about?
I think it started with the Romans, and the Romans loved Ornithologus caniculus, the European rabbit, the specific species that came out of. When I say the Iberian Peninsula, it's Spain and Portugal, that area. They loved this rabbit. Unfortunately, they were exploiting this rabbit. However, there are some early examples, of these rabbits being domesticated as household, maybe not household companions, but certainly as companion animals, like pets. And the Romans carried this European rabbit everywhere. Everywhere they went, they brought this rabbit with them. And eventually, Ornithologus caniculus ended up on every continent except Antarctica. And from there, people would, through breeding, figuring out which character traits, which characteristics they wanted to have for the rabbit, whether it was floppy ears or a white coat or a large body or whatever, they over centuries managed to breed them. Now, I'm not a proponent of breeding. I'm not saying that this is great that they did that. I'm just saying that it's surprising and it's rather amazing, and that it was all from this one species, Ornithologus caniculus.
That's pretty incredible.
It is. It's very incredible.
Yeah. Just really wouldn't have, like you say, genuinely a fascinating history. I would have never suspected that an animal so ubiquitous almost, like I said, it all comes from this one species. Just amazing.
Yeah,
really is.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with that specific species had the perfect combination of attitude or whatever internal sense made them become friendly toward humans, allowed them to trust humans, unfortunately, in many respects. But, kind of like dogs, like the first dogs were wild wolves, and they would approach humans. I mean, we don't exactly know what happened. There's a lot of theories, but at some point there was this connection between humans and wolves, and we were able to breed them into the dogs we know today. And they're all, every domesticated dog is from a wolf.
Yeah, crazy when you think, the sort of intervention of humans really when you think about dog species, is just it is mind blowing every time you think about that they come from wolves. But
right, yeah,
I would have never suspected the same to be true of rabbits. Thinking about the sort of rabbits in kind of in folklore, if you like, and there's a really interesting passage in the book about Easter and the role that kind of the symbolism of rabbits have played in that. I'd love to hear a little bit about that from you.
Well, yeah, there are a number of theories about how a rabbit came to be associated with Easter. One has to do with a spring goddess named Yoster, who possibly had a cult following in early Britain, and whose sacred animal was supposedly a rabbit or a hare. The most reliable evidence we have for the existence of this goddess and the worship around her is from a Benedictine monk named Bede, Bede, who wrote about her in the 8th century. But he makes no mention of any rabbits or hares or any other animals. And in fact, a more reliable connection between Yoster and logomorphs occurs in the late 19th century, where we find a legend in which the goddess turns a bird into a hare, and thus explaining how this little mammal might lay eggs. And now there's another theory that I think makes more sense, and that comes out of England, and it's connected with the English countryside, and it's home to both hares and these birds called lapwings. And lapwings make their nests in a shallow depression in the soil, and hares do this too. Hares don't build burrows like rabbits do. They have these little depressions. And it's not uncommon, excuse me, for the two species to borrow each other's nests. So, I can imagine some people walking along in the countryside and they come upon what was once a hare depression, a hare nest. It's now a lapwing nest and it has eggs, but they might see a hare run by, and then they come and they find this nest of eggs, and they make this connection that right. hares lay eggs. So there's this whole school of investigation into how rabbits became associated with Easter, but these are just a couple of the theories, and they're really fascinating.
Am I right in saying as well that there was this notion of an Easter fox?
Yeah, there was, before the Easter bunny, there was an Easter fox, and the theory about that is that because foxes have this habit of stealing and burying eggs, that maybe that animal became associated with the Easter egg hunt, where let's try to find the eggs that the fox buried.
I see.
Yeah.
Again, no idea. I'd never heard of an Easter fox until you'd mentioned it.
I had not either until I started researching the book. So, yeah.
I can only imagine the things you must have found out throughout the process of this.
Well, as I said, I had such a great time. Every day was a new revelation for me, and so much fun. Yeah,
definitely. Think there's a passage in the book towards the end where you talk about ways that us as readers can help rabbits. It'd be good to just cover off a couple of those, just so people get the kind of idea. And obviously, we'll pick these up I encourage people to pick these up in the book, but it'd be good to talk about those.
Yeah, I'll just I'll grab the book here and I'll read from them. And the first is treat wild rabbits with kindness. If your yard or garden is overrun with rabbits eating your flowers and vegetables, seek humane solutions. And it goes on to give some examples. Number 2, watch out for nests. Not all rabbits burrow safely underground, so before mowing your lawn, carefully check the grass and watch for patches of brown, dead grass, which may indicate a camouflage nest near the surface. And baby rabbits, they grow up fast, so they'll probably be gone pretty quickly. Another important one is volunteer at your local shelter or rabbit rescue organization. There's plenty to do socializing rabbits to make them more adoptable. And again, just adopt, don't shop. And never. The last one I'll give is really important too, and that is never give rabbits as an Easter present. Well-meaning parents every year will go out and they'll acquire 1 or 2 rabbits and they'll bring them home for their kids before they understand what it takes to take care of a rabbit. You know, rabbits live 10 years or more. They are not easy pets. They're not great starter pets. For example, they don't tell you when they're sick, like a dog or a cat would. So we really need to educate ourselves before we decide we want to bring a rabbit home as a companion. But what often happens is that these parents don't do that, and they end up, after a few weeks or a couple of months, they end up abandoning them at a shelter or dumping them in the wild. They'll dump them in a park. And in fact, my wife and I were walking. We live in an urban area, and we were walking back in June on a Sunday morning, and we saw 2 rabbits just on the street corner, nibbling grass. And I knew right away that these rabbits did not belong there. And we managed to scoop them up and bring them home and care for them. And I'm almost positive they were abandoned Easter bunnies. So yeah, there's just, I thank you for bringing that up, Jim, that there's a section in the book that really talks about how important it is that we take care of these wild and domesticated rabbits.
Yes, so important. And picking up on that last point, you know, I'm reminded of my childhood in the UK. I don't know if it's much the same in the States, but rabbits often considered the starter pet for young children, often given in very small hutches, not considering, you know, the kind of the space they're given and so on. And, you know, I think back to those times when I either, you know, my parents had bought me a rabbit at sort of 5 or 6 years old, and it being in this small hutch and so on. And I sort of think, you know, now I wouldn't do the same with my little one.
Yeah. There was a movement in the 19th century in England that I talk about in the book, that rabbits were great for kids, especially for boys, because having the responsibility of taking care of a rabbit would keep them out of trouble, keep the boys out of trouble. And it was good for girls to have kind of a surrogate baby, you know, so they'd learn how to care for someone. So that whole movement about being great starter pets, I think started in the 19th century, and it's been difficult to disabuse people of that ever since.
Yeah. Well, I think a good start for people might be to pick up your book and get educated in the way of the rabbit. Absolutely. Just before we get going, though, before we send folks off, it would be absolutely remiss of us not to tell people where to go about getting a copy, because I've picked up one myself. It is genuinely fantastic. Like you say, a real. I imagine it was a joy to write. It's a joy to read, and does feel like this really welcome kind of pressure valve release, if you like, from our day-to-day kind of thoughts of activism and the plight of animals. So I thank you again for it. But where would folks go about picking one up?
Oh, thanks, Jim. Well, you can get it anywhere that sells books. You can ask your local independent bookstore to have it. You can order it online, all the usual places. People ask me if there's a specific way to order it that benefits me, which is kind, but I end up donating quite a bit of what I earned from these books, which isn't a lot anyway, to animal organizations. So the best thing you can really do is just support your local independent bookstore, I think. And if you do order it online, you can go to my website, markhawthorne.com, and click on the link for the book. And I have several places on there. I don't make any money from these links. They're just places that I know, places like Amazon and Book Depository and other places that sell it. So, but it's available everywhere, fortunately. So.
Great stuff. And definitely I'd recommend folks picking up a copy of Striking at the Roots as well, 10 years on and still just as relevant. So you definitely pick up a copy at your local bookstore whilst you're there too.
Thank you.
Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thank you again for The Way of the Rabbit and all the amazing work that you do within the sort of vegan activism space. It's so well needed, and your voice is one that is well respected, and we're all very grateful for. So I thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks for all you do. And again, congratulations on the success of your podcast. It's wonderful that you're doing what you're doing and helping people who are new to activism or people like me who think they know it all. Just kidding.
Appreciate it, Mark. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
This is a Bloody Vegans production.